A small white pill lies on a flawlessly clean quartz kitchen countertop, its round shape perfect, like a promise carved from pressed snow. Nearby stands a glass of water. Droplets of condensation have formed on its cold, fogged sides, trembling in the slanted rays of the morning light, as if alive. The sun floods the room with a merciless, almost sterile radiance, reflecting off the chrome surfaces and turning the dust motes in the air into tiny, slowly dancing diamonds. Silence. This is not the peaceful silence of a country morning, but a dense, deafening emptiness, a vacuum that has absorbed all the familiar sounds of the house, the steady hum of the refrigerator, the barely audible ticking of the wall clock, the distant muffled noise of the waking street. In the next room, on an expensive, light-colored fabric sofa, a body lies, and its lips are stained a strange, unnatural blue, as if someone had carelessly touched them with a brush dipped in ink or the juice of a poisonous berry. This pill is not a harbinger of pain relief, but the period at the end of a sentence, written by a strange, indifferent hand on the page of a stranger's life. It is a triumph of the most complex chemical engineering, the pinnacle of pharmaceutical thought, born in sterile, gleaming laboratories trusted by millions of people around the world. It promised relief from pain, promised a return to a normal life, but instead, it brought with it this impenetrable, viscous silence that now filled this sun-drenched house. Its story is not a grim tale of squalid dens and desperate outcasts, as we would like to think, to distance ourselves from the horror. A new generation of opioid-addicted people was being created not in dark alleys, but in doctors' offices. These were not the stereotypical drug addicts. They were high school athletes given OxyContin for a football injury, construction workers for a bad back, suburban mothers for chronic migraines. These were people who followed their doctor's orders, who trusted the medical system. They became physically dependent on a legal, prescribed medication, and then, inevitably, the supply would run out. The doctor would get worried and stop writing prescriptions. The patient would lose their health insurance. The cost of buying pills on the black market, where an 80-milligram pill could sell for $80, became prohibitive. These people, now in the grips of a powerful physical addiction, faced a terrible choice. They could endure the agony of withdrawal, which many describe as the worst sickness imaginable, or find a cheaper, more accessible alternative to feed their habit. And that alternative was waiting for them on the street. It was heroin. The economics were brutal and simple. An 80-a-day OxyContin habit could be replaced by a $10 or $20-a-day heroin habit. The two drugs are molecular cousins, acting on the same opioid receptors in the brain. To a body addicted to oxycodone, heroin feels nearly identical. It was a seamless and devastating transition. The prescription pad became a conveyor belt, moving hundreds of thousands of Americans from the pharmacy to the street corner. The very epidemic that the fashion world had briefly glamorized and then disavowed in the 90s came roaring back. But this time was different. It was bigger, it was more widespread, and its victims were more diverse. This was an epidemic born not of cultural trends, but of corporate greed and medical malpractice. A national tragedy delivered one prescription at a time. The wonder drug had fooled not just a few, but a whole world of patients and doctors, creating a void that only its illicit older brother could fill. In the thin mountain air of Afghanistan, after the autumn of 2001, the world's most powerful armies arrived with the best of intentions. They came to destroy Al-Qaeda, topple the Taliban, and build a new nation from the rubble of the old. And in the immediate aftermath of their arrival, it seemed as if a corner had been turned. The Taliban, in a final harsh display of their power in 2000, had declared the opium poppy un-Islamic. They enforced their edict with brutal efficiency. Fields were plowed under, farmers punished, and in a single growing season, the world's supply of opium was slashed by over 90%. It was a stunning, if ruthless, act of supply-side interdiction. For a brief moment, it seemed that one of the world's primary sources of heroin had simply been turned off. But the new order, brought in on the wings of cruise missiles and the boots of special forces, had different priorities. The primary mission was stability. It was counter-terrorism. And stability, in the complex mosaic of Afghan tribal politics, meant making alliances. It meant winning hearts and minds. And the hearts and minds of millions of rural Afghans were inextricably linked to the humble, beautiful, and immensely profitable poppy. To destroy the crop was to destroy the livelihoods of entire provinces. It was to create enemies where friends were desperately needed. And so, a quiet, unspoken decision was made. The poppy fields, for the most part, would be left alone. Coalition commanders on the ground, tasked with fighting an insurgency, understood that the farmer whose field you burn today is the man planting an IED for you tomorrow. The warlords, many of whom were now our allies against the Taliban, were the very men who controlled the regional opium trade. To disrupt their business was to disrupt the fragile alliances propping up the new government. It was a devil's bargain, struck in the dust of Kandahar and the valleys of Helmand province. We would turn a blind eye to the poppies, and they would help us hunt the Taliban. The irony, of course, was that the Taliban, now regrouping as an insurgency, saw the very same opportunity. The opium economy was the perfect fuel for an asymmetrical war. It required no complex infrastructure, was drought-resistant, and generated vast sums of cash in a country that had little else to offer the global market. The resurgent Taliban began to operate like a mafia. They didn't need to run all the fields themselves. They just needed to control the ecosystem. They offered protection to farmers. They taxed the harvest. They taxed the traffickers who moved the raw opium paste from the fields to the labs. They taxed the labs that processed the opium into morphine base and then into the final precious diacetyl morphine. Heroin number 4. Every step of the process, from the lancing of the poppy pod to the loading of the bricks onto a Toyota Hilux, generated revenue. A 10% tax here, a 20% tax there, it all added up. The scale of the resurgence was breathtaking. By 2007, just 6 years after the invasion, Afghanistan was producing 93% of the world's illicit opium. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime reported that the value of opium exports had reached $4 billion a year, equivalent to more than half of the country's official GDP. Poppy fields bloomed across the south, a sea of delicate petals, white, pink, and red, that represented a tide of misery for the rest of the world. Helmand province alone was producing more opium than the entire country of Burma, the former world leader. The logistics of moving this product were as old as the Silk Road itself. The primary channel became known as the Balkan route. Convoys of trucks and pack animals moved heroin west out of Afghanistan, across the porous borders of Iran and Pakistan. From there, it was consolidated, trafficked through Turkey, a historic smuggling crossroads, and into the Balkans. In Albania and Kosovo, criminal syndicates prepared it for final distribution in the lucrative markets of Western Europe. Ton after ton of high-purity, low-cost heroin flooded the continent. Purity levels in cities like London and Berlin, which had hovered in the low double digits, started to climb to 40, 50, even 60%. The price collapsed. A drug that had been expensive and relatively hard to come by was now cheap and ubiquitous. Another path, the northern route, snaked north into the former Soviet republics of Central Asia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. From there, it fed a burgeoning crisis in Russia itself, which would soon become one of the countries with the highest per capita rates of heroin addiction in the world. A vast river of opiates, originating in the very country the West had occupied to ensure its own security, was now flowing in all directions, creating instability and funding the very insurgency the soldiers were there to fight. Efforts to stop it were Sisyphean. Eradication teams, often composed of Afghan forces backed by American or British troops, would descend on a field. They would slash the stalks, burn the crop, but for every field destroyed, 10 more were planted just over the next hill. Programs designed to encourage farmers to switch to alternative crops, saffron, pomegranates, were well-intentioned, but ultimately futile. No legal crop could compete with the poppy. A farmer could make 10 times more from a hectare of opium than from a hectare of wheat. And the local opium buyer would come to the farm, paying in cash and often providing seeds and fertilizer on credit. The government, in contrast, offered little support for legal crops. The choice for a person trying to feed their family in one of the poorest places on earth was not really a choice at all. The war on terror became, in a very real sense, a war funded by drugs. Money from the poppy fields bought AK-47s, rocket-propelled grenades, and night vision goggles for the Taliban. It paid the salaries of their foot soldiers. It corrupted the new Afghan government, from the village level up to the highest ministries in Kabul. The very foundations of the state we were trying to build were dissolving in the profits of the flower we had chosen not to destroy. Afghanistan became the world's first true narco-state, a nation whose economy and political life were utterly dependent on a single illicit plant. And all of it happened under the watchful eye of the most sophisticated military and intelligence apparatus the world had ever known. A quiet, tragic, and utterly predictable failure, blooming in plain sight. This glut of potent, cheap heroin created a global user base with an unprecedentedly high tolerance. The market was saturated. The addicts were primed for the next step, for something stronger, cheaper, more synthetic, and a dark shadow was beginning to fall over North America. A shadow born not in a field of flowers, but in the cold, sterile logic of a chemical laboratory. The transition was not a sudden event. It was a quiet replacement, a chemical coup that took place in nameless baggies and dirty spoons. For years, the story of heroin in North America had been a story of two primary sources: black tar from Mexico and the white powder heroin known as China White, which trickled in from Southeast and Southwest Asia. But the economics of the drug trade, like any other business, are governed by risk and reward. And producing heroin is a risky, inefficient business. It requires land. It requires a specific climate. It requires a large, compliant labor force to harvest the opium gum. The supply chain is long, vulnerable, and subject to the whims of weather and law enforcement. Then came fentanyl. It was not a new substance. It had been synthesized back in 1959 by a brilliant Belgian chemist, Paul Janssen. For decades, it had been a respected, if incredibly potent, medical tool. A powerful anesthetic used in operating rooms and a painkiller for cancer patients. delivered via transdermal patches. It was 100 times more powerful than morphine, 50 times more powerful than pure heroin. A godsend for those in agony, a monster lurking in the pharmacopoeia. The shift began when chemists working for criminal organizations realized the immense economic potential of illicit fentanyl production. It required no farms, no peasants, no seasons. All that was needed were the right precursors, a skilled chemist, and a laboratory. The precursors, for the most part, were legally produced and easily acquired from China's vast, loosely regulated chemical industry. Shipped in barrels and falsely labeled as industrial solvents or pigments, they would arrive at the ports of Mexico. There, in super labs run by the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, the synthesis would take place. The logic was brutal and undeniable. A kilogram of heroin might cost $5,000 to produce in Mexico. That kilogram could be sold wholesale in the United States for roughly $80,000, a staggering profit margin. But a kilogram of pure fentanyl, which could be produced even more cheaply, was so potent that it could be used to create the equivalent of 50 kilograms of street product. The potential profit wasn't just greater, it was exponentially, astronomically greater. A single kilogram of fentanyl contained enough lethal doses to kill 500,000 people. The risk of smuggling was also reduced. Instead of moving bulky bricks of heroin across the border, traffickers could now move a substance that was just as profitable in a package the size of a small bag of sugar. At first, fentanyl was used as an additive, a booster. Dealers would mix a small amount into their heroin supply to increase its strength and stretch the product. A user accustomed to a certain dose of heroin would inject what they believed to be their usual amount. But the bag was hot. It contained fentanyl, and the difference was catastrophic. A few extra micrograms, an amount invisible to the naked eye, a few grains of salt. The difference between a familiar euphoric high and immediate respiratory depression. The user would feel the initial warmth, and then nothing. Breathing would slow, become shallow, and then stop. The number of overdoses began to climb at a rate that stunned public health officials. What had been a chronic, smoldering crisis became an acute, explosive catastrophe. In 2013, there were just over 8,000 heroin overdose deaths in the United States, and just over 3,000 from synthetic opioids like fentanyl. By 2017, heroin deaths had doubled to over 15,000, but synthetic opioid deaths had skyrocketed nearly tenfold, to almost 30,000. By 2021, that number would exceed 70,000. It was a quiet, relentless chemical war being waged on the streets of America. It is the story of a brilliant, meticulously planned deception, born in the very heart of respectability, in corporate boardrooms and on the glossy pages of promotional brochures. This was not a choice users made. The market simply changed beneath their feet. The substance they were seeking, the familiar brown or white powder, was no longer what it claimed to be. It was a Trojan horse. Heroin became the delivery system for fentanyl. Soon, the cartels realized they didn't even need the heroin. They could press fentanyl into pills, expertly mimicking prescription opioids like OxyContin or Xanax. A teenager buying a single pill from a friend or on social media, thinking they were experimenting with a pharmaceutical, was actually taking a dose of illicit fentanyl that could stop their heart. The problem grew even darker with the emergence of fentanyl analogs. These were slightly altered chemical cousins of fentanyl, often created by chemists to circumvent specific chemical bans. Compounds like acetylfentanyl, furanylfentanyl, and most terrifying of all, carfentanil. Carfentanil is an elephant tranquilizer. It is 10,000 times more potent than morphine, 100 times more potent than fentanyl itself. A single microgram, a barely visible speck, could be fatal. When carfentanil began appearing in the street supply, even the most hardened users were terrified. Overdoses became almost instantaneous and incredibly difficult to reverse. First responders, paramedics, firefighters, police officers, found themselves on the front lines of this new plague. They arrived at scenes of unimaginable stillness. A man slumped over the steering wheel of his car at a green light. A young couple collapsed in a gas station bathroom. A group of friends, all dead in one room, having shared the same contaminated batch. These scenes repeated daily in small towns and large cities, from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. Morgues overflowed. Coroners couldn't keep up. The sheer scale of the death was difficult to comprehend because it was so quiet, so private, happening behind closed doors. It was not a single dramatic event, but a million tiny, isolated tragedies accumulating into a national trauma. The shadow of fentanyl had completely eclipsed the old world of heroin. The poppy fields of Afghanistan and Mexico, which had so long been the source of the problem, were now almost secondary. The threat was no longer agricultural, it was industrial. It was synthesized in labs, trafficked with the efficiency of a multinational corporation, and distributed with lethal indifference. The wonder drug had always been a liar, but its final synthetic evolution was its most deceptive and deadly trick of all. A trick that left a legacy of destruction so profound, the world is still struggling to even measure its depth, let alone begin the work of repair. The weight of this story is not measured in tons of seized drugs or in billions of dollars of profit, but in absences. An empty chair at the dinner table, a child's room left untouched for years, a voice on an old voicemail that will never be heard again. The legacy of heroin, and now fentanyl, is a story of subtraction, of lives cut short and futures erased. The sheer scale of the loss is staggering, a slow-motion catastrophe that has hollowed out communities and scarred generations. Behind every overdose statistic is a branching network of grief, a family fractured, a circle of friends left to wonder what they could have done differently. And yet, in the face of this overwhelming darkness, a quiet and determined response has begun to form. A response born not of moral judgment, but of pure pragmatism and a desperate desire to keep people alive. This is the philosophy of harm reduction. If you cannot, in the short term, stop people from using a dangerous substance, you can at least take steps to reduce the immediate harm that substance can cause. It is a tacit acknowledgement that the war on drugs, with its focus on punishment and interdiction, has failed to protect the most vulnerable. The most powerful tool in this new arsenal is a drug called naloxone, best known by its brand name, Narcan. It is, in essence, an antidote. An opioid overdose occurs because the drug molecules bind to receptors in the brainstem that control breathing. The drug whispers to the body to stop breathing. Naloxone works through brute force. It has a stronger affinity for those opioid receptors than heroin or fentanyl. When administered, usually as a nasal spray, it rips the opioid molecules off the receptors and takes their place. It blocks their effects. The results are astonishingly fast and dramatic. A person who is blue, breathless, and seconds from death can be brought back to consciousness in under a minute, gasping for air as if they've broken the surface of deep water. For decades, naloxone was a tool used only by paramedics and emergency room doctors. But as the fentanyl crisis accelerated, a movement began to get this life-saving drug into the hands of everyone. Police officers began carrying it. Librarians were trained in its use. And most importantly, it was distributed to drug users themselves and their families. The person most likely to witness an overdose is another person who uses drugs. Empowering them to save a friend's life is perhaps the purest form of harm reduction. It is a simple chemical intervention that says, your life is worth saving right now, in this moment, regardless of the choices that brought you here. Another pillar of this pragmatic approach is the creation of supervised consumption sites, or safe injection facilities. The concept is simple and to some controversial. It provides a clean, safe, supervised space where people can use pre-obtained illicit drugs under the observation of trained medical staff. They are given sterile injection equipment, reducing the transmission of HIV and hepatitis C. And if they overdose, which sometimes happens, nurses are right there with oxygen and naloxone to immediately intervene. Not a single person has ever died of an overdose in a sanctioned, supervised consumption site anywhere in the world. The oldest, InSite in Vancouver, Canada, has saved thousands of lives since it opened in 2003. These sites are not a solution to addiction itself. They are a solution to death. They are a bridge, a point of contact where a person living in the chaos of addiction can connect with healthcare professionals, social workers, and treatment options, perhaps for the first time. They are a doorway out of the alley. Beyond these immediate life-saving measures lies the long, difficult road of recovery. And here, too, science has offered new hope. For many, the most effective path forward is medication-assisted treatment, or MAT. This involves using long-acting opioids like methadone or buprenorphine to manage the physical aspects of addiction. This is not simply substituting one drug for another. Methadone, in use since the 1960s, and the more modern buprenorphine, often combined with naloxone in a drug called Suboxone, work by occupying the same receptors in the brain as heroin, but they do so slowly and for a sustained period. They do not produce an intense, euphoric high. Instead, they eliminate the brutal, agonizing symptoms of withdrawal and quell the relentless, all-consuming cravings that so often lead to relapse. By stabilizing brain chemistry, these medications give a person the chance to rebuild their life. They can hold down a job. They can repair relationships. They can engage in therapy and counseling to address the underlying trauma or mental health issues that may have driven their substance use in the first place. MAT provides a platform of stability from which a person can begin the psychological work of recovery. Nevertheless, despite its proven effectiveness, access remains a huge problem. Not enough clinics, not enough doctors willing to prescribe it, and a deep-seated stigma persists. The belief that true recovery must include complete abstinence, that the use of medication is a crutch or a cop-out. It is a moral judgment that has no place in medicine, a prejudice that costs lives. The history of heroin is a story of deception, a miracle of medicine that became a tool of social control, a commodity culture for revolutionaries, and a synthetic plague for a new century. It has left a legacy of ruin that will take generations to rebuild. The fight against it is no longer a simple war to be won, but a complex, chronic condition to be managed. It is waged not just by police and border agents, but by scientists in labs, social workers in community clinics, parents who carry Narcan in their bags, and the people who every single day make the quiet, courageous choice to fight for their own recovery. In this story, there is no final victory, no easy end to the long night. There is only the slow, difficult work of repairing the damage, of saving one life at a time, of trying to bring a little light back into the vast shadow cast by the poppy and the lab. The miracle that deceived the world has taught us a harsh lesson. Some miracles come at too high a price, and the quiet work of healing is perhaps the only real miracle we have. But to understand how this tiny, perfectly pressed piece of chemistry became a weapon of mass destruction, we must go back through decades and centuries. We must return to the very beginning, to a time when there was no molecule, no patent, no syringe, no prophet. When there was only the flower. Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy, a deceptively simple creation of nature, swaying in the wind in fields bathed in scorching heat. Its pale, waxy green stem, tinged with blue in the haze of the summer noon, stubbornly and silently reaches for the merciless sky. At its peak, a fragile cup of delicate petals, sometimes white as parchment, sometimes pinkish or bluish purple, like the mark of a blow left on skin. But the petals are just a fleeting beauty, a prelude. After they fall, carried away by the hot wind, a pod remains, a small crowned sphere, a seed head, swollen with the promise of new life. And not only that. Inside this perfect sphere, a complex network of the finest vessels carries a milky white sap, a bitter latex known to humanity for millennia. The story begins here, in this sticky sap, in the soft, fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where civilization was born under the scorching sun. At the slow, dusty dawn of history, the Sumerians cultivated fields of these nodding flowers, knowing the intimate secret hidden inside the pod. They went out to the fields in the pre-dawn cool, when the air was still fresh, and with a small, sharp knife of obsidian or bronze, they would make a shallow, careful incision on its resilient skin. Almost immediately, the white milk would begin to seep out, appearing on the surface like the tears of the plant, and slowly thicken in the warm air, mingling with the scent of the damp earth. Left in the sun, it darkened, turning into a sticky, resinous, brownish mass, whose name is opium, a word that would rustle through millennia like a serpent's whisper. They had a name for this plant that said everything about their attitude toward it. Gil-hul, the joy plant. They scratched it in cuneiform on clay tablets, entering it into their first pharmacopoeias. They pressed the dark resin into small tablets and cakes, prescribing them for a multitude of ailments, from uncontrollable coughs to the agonizing pains of dysentery, offering not a cure, but oblivion. But its greatest gift was a gentle, painless slide into sleep, away from the hardships of a harsh and unforgiving world. Knowledge of the joy plant was precious, part of a divine technology passed from healer to healer, from priest to apprentice. From Mesopotamia, it began its slow journey with caravans, a small dark brick of solace, hidden in saddlebags alongside spices and incense, traded for copper, Lebanese cedar, and Egyptian fabrics. It reached the great empires on the banks of the Nile, and in Egypt, the poppy found new and ardent followers. Doctors who were also priests, prescribed opium with a reverence usually reserved for the gods, seeing in it not just a medicine, but a key to other worlds, to communion with ancestors and deities in the smoke of temple incense. The famous Eber's Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts, dating to around 1550 BC, contains dozens of recipes using opium. It was prescribed to soothe crying children, a practice that would, thousands of years later, reverberate with horrifying, unimaginable consequences in Victorian England, where opium-laced syrups would become known as mother's helpers. It was used in complex religious rituals as a key that unlocked the gates of the mind for priests seeking divine revelation. The poppy was so integral to their culture and faith that its depictions are found on tombs, and the resin itself was placed in the sepulchres of pharaohs as a final solace in their long and lonely journey to the afterlife. Trade routes expanded, and Phoenician seafarers, the great merchants and adventurers of the ancient world, carried opium on their ships across the turbulent Mediterranean Sea. They brought it to Carthage, to Spain, and most importantly, to Greece, where a completely different fate awaited it, a fate intertwined with logic and myth. Here, in the cradle of Western thought, opium was not just a medicine. It was woven into the very fabric of mythology and philosophy. The Greeks associated the poppy with the gods of sleep and dreams. Hypnos, the god of sleep, and his son Morpheus, who sent visions to humans by taking the form of any mortal. It was also linked to Thanatos, the god of painless death, acknowledging its dual, dangerous nature. It could bring a gentle sleep, but too large a dose could bring an eternal sleep from which there was no waking. They understood they were walking a razor's edge, that the gift of oblivion and the gift of death were merely a matter of dosage. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, rejected the magical thinking that surrounded illness, but he did not reject opium. He highly valued its use as a painkiller and styptic, codifying its application and giving it a new aura of scientific respectability in his writings, separating it from priestly rituals. By the time the Roman Empire rose to dominate the known world, opium had become perhaps the most widely used and effective drug in the physician's arsenal. The legions marched with it. Doctors carried it in their field bags to treat the horrific wounds on the battlefields from Gaul to Judea, dulling the pain of the gladius and the pilum. In the teeming, noisy, and filthy city of Rome, street vendors sold it alongside bread and wine, crying out its virtues on street corners. The most famous physician of the Roman era, Galen of Pergamon, was a true believer, seeing in opium a near panacea for everything from headaches and epilepsy to snake bites and melancholy. He included it in his legendary remedy, theriac, a complex mixture of dozens of ingredients that was the gold standard of Roman medicine for centuries. Galen's writings were preserved and studied for the next millennium and a half, and with them, opium's impeccable, time-tested reputation as a gift from the gods. For centuries, this state of affairs persisted. The dark resin of the poppy was a constant, a reliable friend in a world full of pain, but its power was unpredictable and capricious. The potency of one batch of opium harvested in Anatolia could differ dramatically from another from Persia, depending on the soil, the weather, and the time of harvest. A dose that brought relief one day could prove fatal the next. It was a powerful but crude, unrefined tool, and medicine was an art, not a science, and the application of opium was its highest and most dangerous expression, a balancing act on the edge between relief and ruin. But the world was changing, and the age of alchemy, with its mysticism and secret formulas, was giving way to the age of chemistry. In the flickering, unsteady light of early 19th century gas lamps, a new kind of mind began to ask a new kind of question. It was no longer enough to know that opium worked. They wanted to know why. They wanted to take the plant of joy apart, as a watchmaker disassembles a complex mechanism, and find the engine of its power. They wanted to isolate its soul, its quintessence. And in a small, quiet town in Germany, a young and determined apothecary's apprentice was poised to do just that. His name was Friedrich Zerturner, a young man barely in his 20s, working as an assistant in an apothecary in Paderborn. He was not a celebrated professor or a wealthy industrialist. He was simply curious and possessed a dangerous degree of persistence bordering on obsession, which drove him to work while others slept. Night after night, after the apothecary closed, when the streets fell silent and the town sank into sleep, Zerturner worked in his humble, cramped backroom laboratory, obsessed with the mystery of opium. He was convinced that the raw, sticky resin was a cocktail of different substances, and that one of them, one single active ingredient, was responsible for its profound, mind-altering effects. He called this hypothetical substance Principium somniferum, the sleep-inducing principle, and his goal became to capture this elusive essence. The work was painstaking, tedious, and fraught with risk. Using the crude tools of early chemistry, glass retorts, spirit lamps, and mortars, he began a process of systematic chemical assault on the raw opium. He dissolved the dark resin in acid, then carefully neutralized it with ammonia, causing a substance to precipitate out as tiny, dingy, grayish-yellow crystals. He had isolated something, but what was it? He had to know. He had to see its power with his own eyes, to feel it for himself. He tested his new compound on stray dogs and mice he caught in his backyard, and the results were astonishing and frightening. The animals fell into a deep, unrousable sleep, so motionless it resembled death. But after a few hours, upon waking, they seemed completely unharmed, albeit lethargic. This, he believed, was the pure essence of opium's power, its soul in crystalline form. But to be sure, to truly prove its effect on humans, he needed human test subjects. And in 1817, in an act of scientific bravery bordering on madness, he recruited 3 of his young friends and made himself the first guinea pig in this dangerous experiment. He carefully measured out a dose of the crystals for himself and his companions. A tiny amount, just half a grain, about 30 milligrams. They swallowed the bitter, caustic powder, washing it down with water, and waited, listening to the beating of their own hearts in the silence of the lab, filled with the smell of chemicals and the cool night air. 30 minutes passed. Nothing. Zerturner, feeling a mixture of disappointment and perhaps some foolishness, decided to double the dose. He gave each of them a whole grain. This time the effect was unmistakable. A pleasant, heavy warmth spread through their limbs. A leaden fatigue, irresistible and strangely calming, enveloped their minds, muffling all sounds. But Zerturner, seized by scientific fervor, was not satisfied and went further, administering a 3rd dose, and then the effects became violent and uncontrollable. Nausea, dizziness, and a crushing headache descended upon them. One of his friends collapsed into a stupor so deep he did not respond to shouts or shoves. realizing he had gone too far, that he was teetering on the edge of poisoning his friends and himself, Serturner had to act. In a panic, he administered a powerful emetic, a large dose of vinegar, to induce vomiting and purge the substance from their systems. They all survived, though they were shattered, pale, and sick, but alive. The experiment was a success. He had found it. He had isolated the first active alkaloid ever extracted from a plant and opened a new era in pharmacology. He named his creation morphium after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams, a fitting tribute to the ancient power he had now tamed, concentrated, and purified. The name was later standardized to morphine. At first, the discovery was largely ignored. Serturner was an unknown from a provincial town, but over time, the significance of his work began to spread through the scientific community. The French chemist Joseph-Louis Gay-Lussac recognized the genius of the discovery, and soon pharmaceutical companies like Merck in Germany began commercial production of morphine. The impact on medicine was revolutionary. For the first time, doctors had a painkiller of known and constant purity that could be administered with mathematical precision. A dose of morphine in London was the same as in Paris or Vienna. It was 10 times more potent than raw opium, a concentrated and reliable weapon against pain. It transformed surgery from an agonizing ordeal in a butcher's shop into a survivable procedure and brought relief to cancer patients, sufferers of neuralgia, anyone in the grip of unbearable pain. It seemed a pure, unadulterated miracle. But this miracle had a dark twin, a shadow that followed it closely, and a new technology was about to unleash it on a scale the world had never seen. In the 1850s, the Scottish physician Alexander Wood and the French surgeon Charles Prévaz independently developed the hypodermic syringe. For the first time, a drug could be delivered directly into the bloodstream, bypassing the slow and inefficient route of the digestive system, with an instantaneous and profoundly powerful effect. The marriage of pure morphine and the hypodermic needle was a turning point in history, creating a method of delivering relief that was faster, more intense, and more effective than anything that had come before. And it arrived just in time for war, for industrial-scale slaughter of an unprecedented kind. The American Civil War, which began in 1861, was a conflict of unparalleled brutality. The weapons were new and terrible. The Minié ball, a large-caliber soft lead bullet, shattered bones and tore flesh in a way that made amputation the most common surgical procedure. The battlefields were scenes of unimaginable carnage, and the field hospitals were worse, factories of death and suffering. Overwhelmed surgeons, sleeves rolled to their elbows, worked in blood-soaked tents with little to no concept of sanitation, on an endless line of screaming, mutilated men. Pain was as much an enemy as the opposing army, and the medical corps had two invaluable tools: chloroform anesthesia for the operation, and morphine for the brutal, lingering pain that came after. Morphine was distributed on a massive scale, saving countless men from death by shock and agony. But when the war ended in 1865, and the surviving soldiers, the veterans of Gettysburg and Antietam, returned home, they brought with them a new, invisible affliction. They were missing limbs, their bodies were scarred, and their minds were haunted by the things they had seen and done. And for many of them, there was another, more insidious wound, a deep, gnawing craving for the drug that had seen them through the war. They had left the battlefield, but they could not leave behind the needle and the little bottle of morphine solution. The condition became so common that it acquired a name: the soldier's disease, the first modern epidemic of iatrogenic, or physician-caused, addiction. These men, once celebrated as heroes of the Union or the Confederacy, were now often seen as moral failures, their morphinism a private shame, a sign of weak character. They were the first generation to discover the terrible paradox of Serturner's creation, that a cure for pain could create a unique suffering all its own, a prison with walls of pure relief. Medicine had solved one problem, the wild, unpredictable nature of opium, only to create a new and more terrifying one. The desperate search for a solution now began. The world needed a painkiller with all the power of morphine, but none of its terrible curse of addiction. The world needed a safer alternative, and in the gleaming, state-of-the-art laboratories of a rising German chemical giant, a team of scientists believed they were on the verge of creating it. They were looking for a hero. The setting for our next scene is not an ancient field or a makeshift military hospital, but a place of gleaming modernity and industrial ambition. This is Elberfeld, Germany, in the final years of the 19th century, the heart of the Kaiser's industrial empire, where the air was thick with the smoke of coal furnaces and the smell of chemicals. And the protagonist is not a single man, but a corporation, Friedrich Bayer and Company. Bayer was a titan of industry, a chemical powerhouse that had built its fortune not on medicine, but on color. They were masters of synthetic dyes, conjuring brilliant blues and vibrant reds from the black, sticky waste of coal tar. Their success was built on rigorous research, a deep faith in chemistry, and a keen sense of the market. Having conquered the world of textiles, they turned their formidable research and development apparatus to a new, even more lucrative frontier: pharmaceuticals. In 1897, their new pharmaceutical division had already scored an impressive success. They had taken a folk remedy, salicylic acid from willow bark, which was effective against fever and pain but brutal on the stomach, and chemically modified it, creating acetyl salicylic acid. It was a gentler, more effective version of the original. They would soon release it onto the world market under a new trade name, aspirin. It was a triumph of industrial chemistry, a model for how nature could be improved upon. And the head of Bayer's pharmacology lab, a confident and ambitious professor named Heinrich Draeser, was eager to apply this model to another, more challenging problem. The problem was morphine. By the 1890s, soldier's disease was no longer just a problem for veterans. Morphine addiction had become a widespread social evil, affecting people from all walks of life, often those who had been prescribed the drug for chronic conditions. It was a medical nightmare and a public relations disaster for the pharmaceutical industry. At the same time, there was a desperate need for effective respiratory medicines. Tuberculosis, bronchitis, and pneumonia were rampant killers, and their primary symptom was a deep, racking, and persistent cough. This cough exhausted patients, prevented them from sleeping, and hastened their decline. The best available cough suppressant, or antitussive, was codeine. Codeine was another alkaloid found in opium, much milder than morphine, and believed to be less addictive. But its mildness was its defining feature. It was often not strong enough to suppress the violent coughing fits associated with serious lung diseases. Morphine, on the other hand, was an excellent cough suppressant. It worked by depressing the cough center in the brainstem, but it had that terrible side effect. It also depressed the respiratory center, located right next door. In the weak, fragile patients who needed it most, a dose of morphine sufficient to stop the cough could could also be sufficient to stop their breathing. And of course, there was the addiction. This was the exact task that Professor Dreiser set for his team. He wanted a new drug, a drug with the cough-suppressing power of morphine, but without its dangerous tendency to shut down the lungs. And most importantly, he wanted a drug that was non-addictive. He believed it was possible to chemically separate the good effects of morphine from the bad. He wanted to create a safe morphine. The task of synthesizing this new wonder drug fell to a young chemist in his lab named Felix Hoffmann. Hoffmann was a talented and methodical chemist, the same man who, just 11 days earlier, had successfully synthesized a stable, marketable form of aspirin. He was on a roll. His method was the same one he had used to create aspirin from salicylic acid: acetylation. This was a standard chemical technique, attaching an acetyl group to a molecule to change its properties. Hoffmann took pure morphine, derived from Bayer's vast stockpiles of opium, and boiled it with a chemical called acetic anhydride. It was a simple, though noxious, process that filled the lab with acrid fumes. The result was a new molecule, a fine white crystalline powder. The chemical name was diacetylmorphine. Two acetyl groups had been attached to the morphine molecule. Hoffmann had done his job. He had created the substance. Now it was up to Heinrich Dreiser to find out what it could do. Dreiser began testing the new compound, which he would soon name heroin, in his laboratory. He started with animals, mice, guinea pigs, and rabbits. The results were immediately encouraging. It was a remarkably powerful cough suppressant. It calmed the animals' breathing far more effectively than codeine. Crucially, at the doses he was testing, it didn't seem to cause the dangerous levels of respiratory depression that morphine did. On the surface, it appeared to be safer. The next step was human trials. These were not the rigorous, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies we would expect today. Dreiser and his team began by testing the drug on themselves, their assistants, and then on workers at the Bayer factory who were suffering from coughs. The reports were ecstatic. The substance was astonishingly effective. A very small dose could stop the most persistent, hacking cough, allowing for a peaceful night's sleep. But there was another effect, a side effect, that was noted with great interest. The test subjects reported a feeling of pleasant euphoria. It made them feel good. They felt strong, clear-headed, and full of energy. One report noted that the drug produced a feeling of heroism. This observation lit a fire in Dreiser's shrewd marketing mind. He saw a name. This was a heroic drug, one that would conquer sickness and suffering. He officially named the substance heroin, from the German word heroisch. But he saw it as more than just a cough suppressant. He envisioned a far grander, more audacious application. Based on his flawed and dangerously limited observations, Dreiser became convinced that heroin was non-addictive. More than that, he hypothesized that it could be a cure for morphine addiction. His reasoning was a tragic leap of faith, grounded in wishful thinking rather than reality. He believed that heroin would satisfy the physical craving for opiates without producing the same soporific, stupefying effects as morphine. He imagined that a morphine addict could be transitioned to heroin. And then, because heroin was supposedly non-addictive, they could simply be weaned off it with little to no discomfort. He had found the Holy Grail, a non-addictive substitute for morphine that could also treat morphine addiction. It was the perfect product. In November 1898, Heinrich Dresser presented his findings at the Congress of German Naturalists and Physicians. He extolled the virtues of his new discovery. He declared it to be 10 times more effective as a cough suppressant than codeine, but with only a fraction of morphine's side effects. He positioned it as a miracle drug, a testament to the power of German science and Bayer's industrial prowess. The medical community was captivated. Bayer immediately launched a massive international marketing campaign. They sent out free samples of heroin to thousands of doctors across Europe and the United States. They published articles in medical journals, lauding its efficacy for treating not just coughs, but asthma, tuberculosis, and even whooping cough in children. It was sold as a liquid, in tablets, and in flavored glycerin elixirs to make it palatable for children. It was advertised as a safe, non-addictive alternative. The hero had arrived to save the world from the tyranny of respiratory illness and the scourge of morphine addiction. The deception, born from a mixture of wishful thinking, flawed science, and boundless commercial ambition, was complete. The world, desperate for a miracle, was ready to believe, and so the trap was set. Bayer began producing heroin by the ton, shipping its little bottles of white powder to every corner of the globe, unaware or perhaps unwilling to see that they were not curing an epidemic, but preparing to unleash a plague. The first threads of the Great Deception began to unravel not in the loud pronouncements of prestigious medical organizations, but in the quiet, concerned correspondence of ordinary doctors. They began as whispers, as scattered anecdotes from the front lines of medicine. A physician in Philadelphia wrote a short letter to a medical journal in 1900, noting with a tone of clinical curiosity that several of his tuberculosis patients, whom he had prescribed heroin to control their coughs, required ever-increasing doses to achieve the same effect. More troublingly, when they tried to stop the drug, they were seized by a peculiar and severe form of distress. A pharmacist in Boston noticed that certain customers were returning for Bayer's cough elixir with alarming frequency, their colds seemingly lasting for months on end. They were pale, thin, and agitated if he happened to be out of stock. In France, doctors treating morphine addicts with the new remedy observed a disturbing phenomenon. Their patients did indeed stop using morphine, but they simply transferred their devotion to heroin with a startling ferocity. They termed this new condition heroinism, and it seemed far more voracious and intractable than the one it was meant to replace. These were the early signals, the first tremors before the earthquake. For a time they were dismissed. Bayer, when confronted with these reports, confidently assured the medical community that these were isolated incidents, likely due to improper administration or the psychological makeup of the patients. The drug, they insisted, was non-addictive. Their research had been conclusive, and for a while, the world believed them. The drug was simply too effective, the relief it brought too profound, for doctors to abandon it based on a few scattered reports. The alternative was to return to the weaker, more obviously addictive codeine, or the dreaded morphine. But the threads continued to unravel, and soon the whispers grew into a chorus of alarm. The central, catastrophic flaw in Bayer's miracle was a simple matter of biochemistry, one that had been tragically overlooked in their initial research. Diacetylmorphine, heroin, was essentially a delivery system. Its two acetyl groups made it more fat-soluble than morphine, allowing it to cross the blood-brain barrier with astonishing speed and efficiency. Once inside the brain, the body's enzymes rapidly cleaved off those acetyl groups, converting the compound back into morphine. The user wasn't experiencing a new, non-addictive substance. They were experiencing a supercharged dose of morphine delivered directly to the brain's opioid receptors with a speed that produced a far more intense and immediate euphoria. This rapid onset was the key to both its perceived efficacy and its devastatingly addictive power. It created a reinforcement cycle that was far more potent than that of its slower-acting parent. The concept of tolerance began to fill the pages of medical literature. Doctors described how a patient who once found relief from a single 5 mg tablet now required 10, then 20. The cough was long gone, but the need for the medicine remained, transforming into a gnawing physical imperative. And with tolerance came the true horror: withdrawal. The uneasiness described in those early letters was given a more detailed and terrifying vocabulary. It was a full system collapse. Doctors described the symptoms with a sort of frightened detachment. Uncontrollable yawning, watering eyes and nose, profuse sweating followed by chills and goosebumps, the symptom that gave rise to the chillingly descriptive slang, cold turkey. Then came the muscle spasms, the vomiting, the diarrhea, the insomnia, the all-consuming anxiety and despair. It was the agony of morphine withdrawal, but many physicians reported that it came on faster and was, at least subjectively, far more severe. The body, deprived of the substance it had been rewired to expect, was screaming in every way it knew how. The deception was now exposed. The heroic cure for morphine addiction was not only addictive itself, but by some estimates, 2 to 3 times more potent, creating a dependency that was significantly harder to break. The free samples that Bayer had so generously distributed had served as a vast, uncontrolled clinical trial, and the results were pouring in. Sanatoriums and asylums, once filled with alcoholics and morphine addicts, began reporting a new class of patient, the heroin habitué. These were not at first shadowy figures from the criminal underworld. They were teachers, clerks, housewives, and laborers, ordinary people who had been prescribed a cough remedy and found themselves in a chemical trap from which there was no easy escape. The very doctors who had championed the drug were now faced with the monumental task of undoing the damage they had unwittingly caused. The medicine cabinet, once a source of comfort and relief, had become a cage for thousands. By 1905, the American Medical Association had dropped heroin from its list of approved medicines, striking its name from the new and non-official remedies. The medical community, once the drug's greatest advocate, began to turn its back on its fallen hero. The deception was laid bare, leaving behind a trail of shattered dependencies and a problem that was about to spill out of the clinics and onto the streets. The transition from remedy to menace was not instantaneous. It was a slow curdling, a process that unfolded over the first decade and a half of the new century. As respectable physicians grew increasingly wary and then outright hostile toward heroin, a profound shift occurred in how and by whom it was used. The drug, having lost its medical legitimacy, did not simply vanish. Instead, it began a downward migration, slipping from the sanitized world of pharmacies into the murky, unregulated spaces of urban life. The user base began to transform. The middle-class patient with a cough was replaced by a new core: disaffected soldiers returning from the Spanish-American War, laborers in the sprawling industrial cities, petty criminals, prostitutes, and the denizens of the urban underbelly. These were people living on the margins, for whom the drug's powerful euphoric oblivion was not a side effect to be managed, but its main appeal. The method of consumption also evolved. The era of the sweet medicinal elixir was over. New users purchased the powder, now manufactured by less scrupulous chemical firms or diverted from legal supplies. They discovered its effects were more potent, not when swallowed, but when snorted. Sniffing parties became a feature of bohemian and criminal circles in cities like New York. Soon after, the most efficient and dangerous method of all was popularized: injection. The hypodermic syringe, a recent medical innovation, became the tool that cemented the drug's reputation. It allowed for the most direct and potent delivery, but it also brought with it the new horrors of abscesses, infections, and the easy transmission of disease. Heroin was no longer a medicine. It was a jolt, a fix. Its identity was being reforged in the shadows. This transformation coincided with a period of immense social anxiety in the United States. The progressive era was in full swing, a time of great reform, but also of great fear. Fear of rapid industrialization, of teeming cities, of new waves of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, and of racial tensions. In this charged atmosphere, heroin addiction became more than a personal tragedy. It was framed as a social contagion, a threat to the very fabric of the nation. Newspapers, eager for sensational stories, began running screaming headlines about dope fiends and drug-crazed criminals. Heroin, in the public imagination, was linked to vice, crime, and foreignness. It was no longer a German wonder drug. It was an insidious poison, corrupting American youth and undermining its moral fiber. The addict, once seen as a patient, an unfortunate victim to be pitied and treated, was now recast as a junkie, a dangerous, morally weak deviant to be feared and punished. This moral panic created the perfect political climate for federal action. For decades, drug regulation had been a patchwork of inconsistent state and local laws. But now, a powerful movement for federal control was gaining momentum, driven by a coalition of reformers, diplomats, and law enforcement officials. A key figure in this movement was Dr. Hamilton Wright, a zealous and ambitious physician appointed as the first U.S. Opium Commissioner. Wright saw drug addiction not primarily as a medical problem, but as a moral and international one. He believed America's domestic drug problem was a national disgrace, undermining its standing on the world stage, and he lobbied tirelessly for a federal law that would bring the trade under strict government control. His efforts, combined with international pressure from conferences in Shanghai and The Hague, paved the way for landmark legislation. The result was the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, passed by Congress in December 1914. On its face, the law was not a prohibition act. It was a tax law, passed under the federal government's constitutional authority to levy taxes. It required any person who imported, manufactured, sold, or distributed cocaine or opium-derived products, including heroin and morphine, to register with the federal government, pay a special tax, and use special order forms. Physicians were permitted to prescribe the drugs, but only in the course of his professional practice only. And in that seemingly innocuous phrase lay a revolution. The key question became, what constituted legitimate professional practice? The law did not specify. The power of interpretation fell to the enforcers, specifically, the Bureau of Internal Revenue within the Treasury Department. And the Treasury Department, staffed by lawyers, not doctors, took a hardline, punitive interpretation. They quickly decided that prescribing narcotics to an addict simply to maintain their habit was not legitimate medical practice. It was merely catering to a vice. The consequences of this interpretation were immediate and catastrophic. Doctors who had been humanely maintaining their addicted patients on stable, legal doses of heroin or morphine suddenly found themselves in legal jeopardy. A series of Supreme Court decisions in the years following the Harrison Act solidified the government's position, effectively criminalizing the medical treatment of addiction. Thousands of doctors were harassed, arrested, and prosecuted. Fearing for their licenses and their freedom, the vast majority of American physicians simply stopped treating addicts. They closed their doors to the very patients who needed help the most. This single act, born of a mixture of good intentions and moral panic, fundamentally reshaped the landscape of addiction in America. It didn't end heroin use. It simply ended its legal supply. The problem was wrenched from the hands of the medical community and thrown into the arms of the criminal justice system. When doctors were pushed out of the game, thousands of users who depended on legal, regulated supplies found themselves in a desperate position. They were sick, suffering from withdrawal, and branded as criminals. Their only recourse was the street, and the street was ready. The Harrison Act, by cutting off legal supplies, had created the perfect conditions for a black market to thrive. The vacuum left by doctors and pharmacists was filled by a new figure, the professional drug trafficker. The price of heroin on the illicit market skyrocketed. Purity became dangerously unpredictable, cut with quinine, sugar, or worse. A public health crisis was officially transformed into a crime wave. Users, to pay the inflated prices for their now illegal medicine, were often forced into theft, prostitution, and other criminal acts. The law had not solved heroin addiction. It had created the modern American drug underground. The little bottle that once sat in the medicine cabinet was now gone. In its place stood the policeman, the prison cell, and the shadowy figure dealing a mysterious powder in a dark alley. The heroic medicine, having deceived the world, was now officially a menace, banished to the very shadows it would help define for the next century. While America was criminalizing its addicts, a new, sophisticated criminal syndicate was rising from the ashes of World War II in Europe. On the bustling, salt-soaked docks of Marseille, Corsican crime clans, hardened by the resistance and post-war chaos, saw a golden opportunity. They became the heart of what would become known as the French Connection. Their genius was in logistics and chemistry. They used their deep-rooted connections to import morphine base from Turkey and the Levant. In clandestine labs hidden in the quiet suburbs of Marseille, talented but unscrupulous chemists, the cooks, transformed this base into the purest, most desirable heroin in the world. Their product was known for its quality, its potency, its trademark. This heroin was then smuggled into the United States, often via the Sicilian mafia, who controlled the ports of New York. It was a well-oiled machine, a multinational corporation of vice that would dominate the American market for decades, supplying a pure, powerful product that fueled addiction in urban centers and created the archetype of the junkie in the public imagination. While the Corsicans were perfecting their European trade route, a far messier and more volatile situation was brewing in Southeast Asia. The region known as the Golden Triangle, the mountainous, lawless borderlands where Burma, Thailand, and Laos converge, was and had long been the world's largest opium farm. Here, the trade was not controlled by a single disciplined organization. It was a chaotic free-for-all of warlords, corrupt officials, and insurgent armies, many of them secretly backed by Cold War intelligence agencies, including the CIA. As a bulwark against communism, they paid their armies in opium. It was the currency of the jungle, and then America went to war in that jungle. Into this already existing, super-saturated opiate market, the United States sent over 500,000 young men. Soldiers, most of them teenagers, ripped from their homes and thrown into a world of incomprehensible heat, fear, and boredom. The mission was a tangled mess. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, and the days were long, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. It was a perfect storm. On one side, a vast local supply of the purest heroin the world had ever seen, processed in mobile jungle labs. It was China white, and it was cheap. Dirt cheap. A vial containing 1/10 of a gram of 95% pure heroin could be bought on the streets of Saigon or at the perimeter of a firebase for $2. On the other side, an army of lonely, frightened, and disillusioned young men. For them, heroin wasn't a party drug. It was medicine. It was an escape pod from a living nightmare. It made the heat bearable. It made the fear recede. It made the endless waiting disappear. A soldier could take a dose, and for a few hours, the war would simply cease to exist. It was the ultimate anesthetic for the soul. Crucially, the method of use was different. In the States, heroin meant needles. It meant shooting up. A taboo, a terrifying leap for a novice. But in Vietnam, the product was so pure it didn't need to be injected to deliver a powerful high. It could be smoked. It was often sprinkled on a cigarette or heated on a piece of foil, with the user inhaling the tendrils of smoke through a tube. A practice known as chasing the dragon. This simple fact changed everything. It lowered the psychological barrier to entry to almost zero. It was just smoking. No needles, no track marks, no shared paraphernalia. It was clean, easy, and discreet. One soldier could try it, feel the blissful release, and share it with a buddy. The contagion spread through platoons, through barracks, through entire divisions. It was an epidemic hiding in plain sight. The military command was slow to grasp the scale of the problem. At first, they saw it as a discipline issue, a few bad apples. But by the late 1960s, the evidence was undeniable. Medics were treating overdoses. Officers were finding their men falling asleep on guard duty. The whispers grew into a roar that eventually reached Washington. The numbers, when they were finally compiled, were staggering. A 1971 Department of Defense study estimated that 40,000 U.S. servicemen in Vietnam were addicted to heroin. Some congressmen believed that 15 to 20% of all enlisted men were users. The White House panicked. President Richard Nixon saw a looming catastrophe. An army of trained, armed, and addicted soldiers returning to American soil. It was framed not as a health crisis, but as a national security threat, an enemy infiltration. In June 1971, Nixon gave a famous speech declaring drug abuse public enemy number one. It was the official declaration of the war on drugs. Its first major campaign was Operation Golden Flow. It was a simple, sweeping, and desperate policy. Every single American soldier had to submit to a urine test before they could board the plane home. If they failed, they were forced to stay in Vietnam for detoxification. The program was riddled with problems. Soldiers found ways to cheat the tests. The detox centers were hastily assembled and often brutal, but its primary effect was to officially identify thousands of addicted young men. They were no longer just soldiers. They were addicts, a label that would follow them home. And when they returned home, their nightmare truly began. They didn't come back to parades, but to protests. Many despised them for participating in an unpopular war, and their drug of choice, the cheap, pure, smokable China White, didn't exist in America. The heroin available on the streets of New York or Los Angeles was a product of the French Connection. It was expensive, often costing $50 a dose, and heavily cut with quinine, lactose, or worse. Its purity rarely exceeded 5 to 10%. It was too weak to be smoked. To get the same high they were accustomed to in the jungle, the returning veterans had only one choice. They had to pick up a needle. They became the new face of the American heroin addict. They weren't jazz musicians or beatniks. They were the boys next door, the high school football stars who had been sent to fight and came back with a wound far deeper and more insidious than any piece of shrapnel. Their addiction, born in the trauma of combat, was now seen as a moral failing, a sign of weakness. They were shunned by the Veterans Administration, which was ill-equipped to handle this kind of problem. They were hunted by law enforcement. They were left to fend for themselves in the country they had been sent to protect. Their personal war continued long after the last helicopter lifted off the roof of the American embassy in Saigon. They were the seeds of a plague, scattered by the winds of war onto the fertile soil of a nation that was beginning to rot from within. The shift was almost imperceptible, like a change in the weather. The glossy, vibrant, athletic bodies of the 1980s supermodels, Cindy Crawford, Naomi Campbell, women who looked like goddesses of health and vitality, began to seem dated. A new decade, the 1990s, brought with it a different mood, a kind of weary cynicism, a post-Cold War ennui. It was the era of grunge music, of Gen X apathy, and the aesthetics of fashion began to reflect this cultural slump. It started in the pages of avant-garde British magazines like The Face and ID, and was championed by a new wave of photographers who rejected the polished artifice of their predecessors. They favored a style that was raw, realistic, almost documentary-like. They shot in cheap apartments, on dirty streets, in dreary liminal spaces. And their subjects, their models, began to look different too. They were impossibly thin, almost skeletal. Their skin was pale, translucent. Their eyes were circled with dark rings, their expressions blank, their poses awkward, as if caught mid-stumble. It was a look of profound exhaustion, of alienation, a look that, to anyone who had seen it up close, was unmistakably the look of a heroin addict. This was heroin chic. The term itself was a provocation, first appearing in the media in the mid-90s to describe this pervasive and disturbing new trend. It was never an official marketing term, of course. No designer or magazine editor would ever use it. But it perfectly captured the essence of the aesthetic they were selling. The undisputed face of this movement became a young, waifish model from Croydon, London, named Kate Moss. Her collaboration with photographer Corinne Day for the British edition of Vogue in 1993 was a defining moment of the era. The photographs, shot in Moss's modest flat, were raw and unglamorous. She wore simple underwear. Her body was thin and unadorned. Her gaze seemed lost. It was a million miles from the sun-drenched beaches and couture gowns that usually filled the magazine's pages. This was beauty as fragility, as vulnerability, as a kind of beautiful damage, and it was revolutionary. It resonated with a generation tired of manufactured perfection. The look spread through high fashion like wildfire. Designers like Calvin Klein built entire campaigns around it, with black and white images of hollow-cheeked youths staring blankly from billboards. The androgyny of the models, the blurring of gender lines, was part of the appeal. It rejected the overt, powerful sexuality of the 80s in favor of something more ambiguous and withdrawn. The message was about retreat, about disengagement from a world that felt overwhelming or meaningless. The clothes themselves reflected this. Slip dresses that hung off bony frames like rags, oversized sweaters, drab colors, grays, beiges, blacks. It was fashion as a kind of stylish surrender. The music amplified the mood. The angst-ridden lyrics of Kurt Cobain, the dark, melancholic sound of bands like Portishead and Massive Attack, provided the perfect soundtrack to this visual culture of decay. And of course, the connection wasn't just aesthetic. Kurt Cobain's own struggles with heroin were public knowledge, lending a grim authenticity to the trend. Musicians, artists, and actors, the figures at the center of popular culture, were dying from the drug. Yet the image of addiction was being commodified, sanitized, and sold back to the public as the height of cool. The problem, of course, was the profound irresponsibility of it all. High fashion, a multi-billion-dollar industry that shapes global ideals of beauty and desire, was actively glamorizing the look of a deadly disease. It stripped the reality of addiction, the sickness, the desperation, the crime, the poverty, the overdoses, of all its horror, and presented only the superficial signifiers, the thinness, the pallor, the detached cool. It was a dangerous fantasy. It made a lethal drug seem romantic, poetic, a kind of tragic badge of honor for the sensitive and artistic soul. The backlash, when it came, was furious. Public health officials, addiction specialists, and parents' groups were horrified. They saw these images for what they were, a reckless normalization of self-destruction. In May 1997, President Bill Clinton gave a speech in which he directly condemned the fashion industry. "The glorification of heroin is not creative," he declared. "It's destructive. It's not beautiful. It's ugly. And this is not about art. It's about life and death." The industry, which had for years deflected criticism by citing artistic expression, was suddenly on the defensive. But the true turning point, the event that shattered the illusion, had come earlier that year. In February 1997, Davide Sorrenti, the brilliant young photographer who had so perfectly captured the heroin chic aesthetic, died. He was found in his New York apartment, surrounded by heroin paraphernalia. His death was the result of a lifelong blood condition, exacerbated by his heroin use. He was just 20 years old. Sorrenti's death sent a profound shockwave through the fashion world. It was a brutal intrusion of reality into their carefully constructed fantasy. This was no longer an abstract aesthetic. This was a dead young man. His mother, the photographer Francesca Sorrenti, launched a public campaign, Awareness, the Davide Sorrenti Appeal, to end the glamorization of drugs in fashion. The industry, shamed and sobered, began to retreat. Magazine editors issued statements promising a new focus on health and well-being. Models started to look a little healthier, a little less hollowed out. The lighting got a little brighter. The era of heroin chic was over almost as quickly as it had begun. It left a strange and lingering cultural residue. For a moment, it had made the abyss look fashionable. It had packaged despair as a luxury good. And even as the fashion world turned away from the imagery of the street junkie, a far more dangerous and widespread opioid crisis was quietly gathering force. Not in the grimy alleyways of the Lower East Side, but in the clean, respectable, and carpeted offices of pharmaceutical companies. The next wave of addiction would not be whispered about. It would be prescribed by a doctor in a little orange bottle with a label that promised, with scientific certainty, that it was safe. The dawn of the 21st century felt, for many, like a time of medical miracles. and one of the most celebrated was the conquest of pain. For decades, the medical establishment had been deeply cautious about prescribing strong opioids for chronic, non-cancer pain, viewing the risk of addiction as too high. But in the mid-90s, a profound shift in thinking began. A shift that was not accidental but engineered by one of the most sophisticated and deceptive marketing campaigns in pharmaceutical history. The architects of this shift were a privately held company from Stamford, Connecticut, called Purdue Pharma, owned by the secretive and immensely wealthy Sackler family. In 1996, Purdue launched a new drug called OxyContin. The active ingredient was oxycodone, a powerful semi-synthetic opioid that had been around for decades and was known to be highly addictive. But Purdue claimed their pill was different. It had a patented time-release mechanism, a special coating called Contin, designed to deliver the medication slowly over a 12-hour period. This, Purdue claimed, smoothed out the drug's peaks and valleys, eliminating the euphoric high that led to abuse and addiction. Their central marketing claim, pushed with relentless force, was that the risk of addiction from OxyContin was less than 1%. It was a stunningly effective and utterly baseless fiction. Purdue Pharma unleashed a marketing blitzkrieg of unprecedented scale and scope. They more than doubled their sales force, creating an army of representatives who targeted not pain specialists, but general practitioners, family doctors in small towns and rural areas across the country. The very doctors who saw the most patients with chronic pain from injuries, arthritis, and back problems. These sales reps were armed with misleading charts, biased studies funded by Purdue itself, and a simple, powerful message. Doctors were failing their patients by letting them suffer. A new concept was being pushed within the medical community, partly influenced by Purdue. Pain should be treated as the fifth vital sign, as important as blood pressure or heart rate. On the surface, it was a compassionate idea, but it created immense pressure on doctors to eliminate pain at all costs, and Purdue offered the perfect, simple solution. The incentives were enormous. Sales reps earned huge bonuses based on the volume of OxyContin prescribed by doctors in their territory. Doctors, in turn, were showered with attention and perks. Purdue flew thousands of them to pain management seminars in sun-drenched resorts in Florida and California, where they were treated to lavish dinners and reassuring speeches from paid medical experts who downplayed the risks of addiction. They distributed branded fishing hats, coffee mugs, and even swing music CDs with titles like "Get in the Swing with OxyContin." It was an all-encompassing campaign to change the culture of medicine, to re-educate a generation of doctors and convince them that this powerful narcotic was a safe, non-addictive miracle. And it worked. Prescriptions for OxyContin skyrocketed. Sales grew from $48 million in its first year to over $1 billion just 4 years later. The drug was being prescribed for everything from post-surgical pain to chronic backaches and fibromyalgia. Purdue deliberately targeted areas with high rates of workplace injuries, like Appalachia, the Rust Belt, and rural Maine, turning entire communities into epicenters of the burgeoning epidemic. The central lie, of course, was the time-release formula. It didn't take long for users to figure out that the entire dose of oxycodone could be released at once simply by crushing the pill and snorting the powder, or dissolving it in water and injecting it. This completely bypassed the time-release mechanism, delivering a massive heroin-like euphoric rush. The very feature that Purdue had touted as a safety precaution became the vector for abuse. The company knew about this vulnerability from the beginning, but this information was concealed. Reports of widespread abuse, of pills being sold on the street for $1 a milligram, of pharmacy robberies began to surface across the country. But for years, Purdue deflected the blame. They insisted the problem wasn't the drug, but the criminal abusers who weren't using it as directed. They even invented and promoted the concept of pseudo-addiction, a dangerous theory suggesting that patients exhibiting signs of addiction, such as clock-watching for their next dose or demanding higher prescriptions, were not actually addicted, but were simply suffering from undertreated pain. The solution, they argued, was to prescribe them even more opioids,